And in Paris, so near in space, seemingly so far away in time, morbid visitors looking for the effects of war asked where they could find the church upon which a shell from Big Bertha had made its terrible direct hit. All of us went to the Grand Opera many times, my own first visit being to hear Aida and to see the Au Monde of Paris, once again in evening clothes, glittering up and down the marble staircases between acts. Someone pointed out René Fonck in the crowd, and I still remember the ribbon of the great airman's Croix de Guerre as long as a ruler to accommodate all the palms he had won. There is a timelessness about Grand Opera in Paris, and except for the uniforms, there was no hint that the greatest war in history had come so recently to an end. I paid $1 that night for a pack of American cigarettes, but this was not my most memorable financial transaction. A week or two after our arrival, Corcoran and I had paid $1 apiece for fried eggs, and almost as much for marmalade. I sometimes ate with the doughboys, who never got used to French food, and groused about American Army grub. In Verdun one day, we ate Army beans and the rest of the rations, using borrowed mess kits. "Look at them guys eat that stuff," one private said. "I'll be damned if they don't like it." We also liked the wheat cakes, with genuine maple syrup, served at an army kitchen set up in the basement of the Crillon, the deluxe hotel in the heart of Paris, which had been taken over by the Americans. I saw no doughboys or gobs at the opera, but they crowded into the cinemas when they opened to watch the American films of 3 actors popular with the French, W.S. Hart, Le Roi d'Orange, Harold Lloyd, known as Louis, and Douglas Fairbanks' Père, lovingly called Douglas by the French. When I finally sailed back home, 16 months had elapsed since the armistice, and the brave new world was taking on its disillusioning shape. Theodore Roosevelt had died in 1919, which marked in its way the end of an era, and Woodrow Wilson had come down from his dizzy pinnacle of fame and hope and was on his way to his own dismayed and frustrated end. Before long, a celebrated room was to be filled with smoke, out of which a political magician named Harry M. Doherty would produce the shadowy figure of Warren Gamaliel Harding and the misleading motto of return to normalcy in a period of flagpole sitting, non-stop dancing, channel swimming, ocean flying, husband murder, novels of disenchantment, and approaching financial chaos. I reached New York, still without a hat. It was March and blustery in New York, and one of the first things I did was to buy one. It fitted my head and seemed to my repatriated eye extremely becoming. It wasn't until later that day that I looked inside the hat to see the mark of the maker. I quote from a piece I wrote in 1923 for the Columbus, Ohio Sunday Dispatch. Something inside the crown caught my eye. I looked more closely. Fabriqué par Moisant et Amour, 25 Avenue de l'Opéra, Paris, it said. Paris, city of light and of occasional darkness, sometimes in the winter rain seeming wrought of monolithic stones, and then in the days of its wondrous and special pearly light, appearing to float in mid-air like a mirage city in the empire of imagination, fragile and magical, has had many a premature requiem sung for the repose of its soul by nervous writers of gloomy historians who believe it is dying or dead and can never rise again. Paris, nonetheless, goes right on rising out of war, ultimatum, occupation, domestic upheaval, cabinet crises, international tension, and dark prophecy, as it has been in the habit of doing since its residents first saw the menacing glitter of Roman shields many centuries ago. Recently, in the New York Sunday Times, John Davenport sang sorrowfully of the Paris of today as a dying city, a city of ghosts, but his funeral arrangements were laughed off by, among others, a South Carolina reader who protested, "It is not Paris, but an Anglo-American myth that is dying." The Americans and English have never become an integral part of the anatomy of the city, which is forever French. Its visitors come and go, hopeful or despondent, comfortable or uneasy, looking in the wrong places for the pulse of the city, feeling in the wrong places for the throb of its heart. I have been in and out of Paris 6 times from 1920 to 1955, and I have had my moments of depression and worry about the great city, but I have never felt that I was sitting up at night with a fatally sick friend. I have seen her moods shift from confidence to despond, for Paris is a lady of temperament and volatility, but I have never felt she was mortally languishing, like a stricken heroine of grand opera. I enjoy arguing with Parisian friends about the true gender of their fair city, pointing out that feminine in my lexicon means neither frail nor frivolous, neither capricious nor coquettish, but female, and summing up with this sound paraphrase of Kipling: the female of the cities is far tougher than the male. In my observation, the female of any species is not, in Simone de Beauvoir's pallid phrase, the second sex, but the first sex, of which the second is luckily born. Frenchmen jump too easily to the inference that lady, when applied to Paris, means poule de luxe, or that what we feminists have in mind is the gay figure evoked when Monsieur Chevalier sings Paris, elle est une blonde. What we really mean is woman in the sense and stature, the sign and symbol, in which she is represented everywhere you look in Paris, from the celebrated statue of the fighting French woman called Quand même in the Tuileries, to the monumental figure on one side of the Arc of Triumph. Or take the statues in the Place de la Concorde, representing 8 great provincial cities of France, all of which are depicted as women. Perhaps the finest, that of Strasbourg, was shrouded in black when I first beheld it, but I was happily on hand when the lady was joyously stripped of her mourning after Strasbourg had been restored to France. Street rioting has broken out in the streets of Paris from time to time, for Paris does not repress her anger any more than she suppresses her desires. And windows are smashed, and buildings are burned, and now and then someone is killed. Once in a while, the United States has been the object of Parisian wrath. 30 years ago, I witnessed a rixe or two, but never a real bagarre, because of our failure to write off the French war debt. There were those at the time who feared that demonstrators might overturn the statue in the Place des États-Unis of Washington and Lafayette shaking hands. It has been marked with chalk, but it will never be overthrown. Not far from these sculptured hands across the sea stands an equally solid monument to the 118 Americans who lost their lives in the service of France during the First World War, 61 of them in the Lafayette Escadrille. The granite tribute contains the indestructible names of Raoul Lufberry, Norman Prince, Kiffin Rockwell, Victor Chapman, and Alan Seeger. This is the American quarter of Paris that I knew so well in the months after the armistice. In front of what was once the chancellery of our embassy at 5 Rue de Chaillot, a statue of Rochambeau salutes the mounted image of George Washington in the Place d'Iéna, not far away. It was indeed bien américain, the time of my first visit, for Woodrow Wilson lived at number 11 Place des États-Unis, and a short walk from there was the Avenue du Président Wilson, and a pension filled with Americans from the embassy. The streets were loud with American voices and bright with our uniforms, and Marines sometimes played baseball in the Rue de Chaillot. A bar advertised American cocktails, and Yanks sang our war songs, including the one with the line, "I'll bring you a Turk and the Kaiser too," which may have inspired the wild notion in some of our men to invade Dorn and bring old Wilhelm back to America as the souvenir of souvenirs. Nearly 20 years ago, I made a pilgrimage to the old Yank district, meeting French friends of mine who were still there, and reading the tablet placed near the door of the former chancellery by the Paris post of the American Legion, a small memorial perpetuating the myth that the late Myron T. Herrick was our ambassador during the War of 1914-18. Actually, he had been replaced in December 1914 by the late William G. Sharp, who served during all but 4 months of the war, but has gone unremembered and unmarked. Legend made Myron Herrick our wartime ambassador, and legend from Barbara Fritchie to Mr. Herrick is more durable than fact. The last time I saw Paris, or heard and sensed the city, since I was no longer able to see the old landmarks, was in the late summer of 1955, and I didn't get around to the once familiar places, which, if you are there and interested in such a ramble, you can find most easily by following the Avenue Kléber out of the Place de l'Étoile toward the Seine and the Eiffel Tower. Here are the permanent pages of history written in bronze and stone of America in Paris, and they are worth a morning's walk and an hour's meditation. The second time I saw Paris in 1925, she wore a new gown and a different mood. The Americans had taken over the left bank from the Deux Magots to the Dôme and the Rotonde, and there were almost as many writers and artists as there had been doughboys and gobs. It was the era of Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, and John Dos Passos in Paris, and over the restless new American hive, Gertrude Stein, prophetess of the lost generation, presided like a modernistic queen bee. But that is another memory for another time. A bientôt. The psychosemanticist will see you now, Mr. Thurber. I believe there are no scientific investigators that actually call themselves psychosemanticists, but it is surely time for these highly specialized therapeuticians to set up offices. They must not be carelessly confused with psychosemanticists, who study the effects of mental weather upon the ramparts of the body. The psychosemanticists will specialize in the havoc wrought by verbal artillery upon the fortress of reason. Their job will be to cope with the psychic trauma caused by linguistic meaninglessness, to prevent the language from degenerating into gibberish, and to save the sanity of persons threatened by the onset of polysyllabic monstrositis. We have always been a nation of categorizationists, but what was once merely a national characteristic is now showing signs of malignancy. I shall not attempt to discover the incipient primary lesion, for I am not a qualified research scholar in this field. Indeed, for having had the impudence to trespass thus far, I shall no doubt be denounced by the classificationists as a fractional impractionist, one who hits subjects a glancing blow, an unauthorized incursionist, a unilateral conclusionist, and a presumptuous deductionist. Our national predilection for ponderous phraseology has been traced by one authority as far back as the awkward expression taxation without representation, unjust impost. It is interesting to note that the irate American colonists of that period in our history would be categorized today as anti-taxation without representationists. Not long ago, for the most recent instance in my collection, Senator Lyndon Johnson was described by a Washington newspaperman as a pragmatic functionalist, a term that was used in a laudatory sense. It isn't always easy nowadays to tell the laudatory from the derogatory at first glance, but we should be glad that this Democratic leader is not a dogmatic divisionary or an occlusive impedimentarian. The most alarming incidence of verbal premalignancy occurs, of course, in this very area of politics. But let us skip over such worn and familiar double-jointed isms as creeping socialists, disgruntled ex-employees, ritualistic liberals, massive retaliationists, agonized reappraisalists, unorthodox thinkers, unwitting handmaidens, male, to name only a few out of hundreds, and take a look at excessive pre-war anti-fascism, a colossal, I use the adjective as a noun in the manner of television's spectacular, that was disgorged a few years ago. Here the classificatory degradationists brought a time element into what might be called the post-evaluation of political morality. The operation of this kind of judgment during and after the Civil War would have thrown indelible suspicion upon all the Northern patriots, including Abraham Lincoln, who wanted Robert E. Lee to take command of the federal armies in the field. They would be known today as over-enthusiastic pre-Manassas pro-Leists. The Carson nomenclature of our time is, to be sure, an agglomerative phenomenon of accumulated concretions to which a dozen different types of elaborative descriptivists have contributed, eminently the old communist intellectuals with their dialectical materialists, factional deviationists, unimplemented obscurantists, and so on and so on. Once the political terminologists of all parties began to cross-infect our moribund vocabulary, the rate of degeneration became appalling. Elephantiasis of cliché set in. Synonym atrophied. The pulse of inventiveness slowed alarmingly, and paraphrase died of impaction. Multiple sclerosis was apparent in the dragging rhythms of speech, and the complexion of writing and of conversation began to take on the tight, dry parchment look of death. We have become satisfied with gangrenous repetitions of threadbareisms, like an old man cackling in a chimney corner, and the onset of utter meaninglessness is imminent. The symptoms of this ominous condition show up most clearly in the tertiary stage of controversial figure. The most complicated specimen of this type of modern American is the man of unquestionable loyalty, distinguished public service, and outstanding ability and experience who has nonetheless lost his usefulness. Actually, this victim of verbositosis has not lost his usefulness. His nation has lost it. It doesn't do the national psyche any good to realize that a man may be cut off in the full flower of his usefulness on the ground that that is not what it is. I trust I have made the urgent need for psychosemanticists apparent, even though I have admittedly become contaminated in the process, and I doubt whether my own psychosemanticist, after treating me, will ever be able to turn to my wife and say cheerfully, "Madam, your husband will write clearly again." Before visiting my hypothetical psychosemanticist for a brief imaginary interview, I feel that I should get something reassuring into this survey of depressing ailments of the tongue. We have, then, cured or at least survived various incipient mouth maladies in the past. There was a moment when globalonianism, growing out of the Thai method of word doggle, seemed likely to become epidemic, but it fortunately turned out to be no worse than a touch of pig Latin or a slight case of knock-knock who's there. Congress was not prepared to adapt the telescoping of words, which takes both time and ingenuity, and unless an expression becomes absorbed by congressionalese, it has little chance of general survival. This brings me to what may easily be the direct cause of my being bundled off to the psychosemanticists before long. The beating the word security is taking in this great scared land of ours. It is becoming paralyzed. This is bound to occur to any forceful word when it loses its quality of affirmation and is employed exclusively in a connotation of fear, uncertainty, and suspicion. The most frequent use of security, I hate to add to its shakiness with quotation marks, which have taken on a tone of mockery in our day, is in security risk, weakest link in our chain of security, and lulled into a false sense of security. Precision of speech and meaning takes a small tossing around in the last of those three phrases. Lulled is actually what happens to a nation after it has been argued, tricked, maneuvered, reasoned, coaxed, cajoled, or jockeyed into a false sense of security. But the inflexibility that has descended upon us has ruled out the once noble search for the perfect word and the exact expression. What Eric Partridge calls a poverty of linguistic resource is exemplified by the practically exclusive use of two verbs in any public forum discussion of national security. It is threatened or it is bolstered. I never heard of its being supported, reinforced, fortified, buttressed, or shored up, and only very rarely is it menaced, endangered, or in jeopardy. The word insecurity, by the way, seems to have been taken over by the psychiatrists as their personal property. In politics, as in penology, security itself has come to mean insecurity. Take, for example, this sentence. He was considered a maximum security prisoner because of his police record and was never allowed out of his cell block. Similarly, security data means data of the kind calculated to scare the living daylights out of you, if not indeed your pants off. I could prove that maximum, in the case of the prisoner mentioned above, really means minimum, but I don't want to get us in so deep that we can't get out. The present confused usage of security may have originated with the ancient Romans. Anyway, here is what Cassell's Latin dictionary has to say about securitas. 1. Freedom from care. A, in a good sense, peace of mind, quiet, Cicero. B, in a bad sense, carelessness, indifference, Tacitus. 2. Transfer, freedom from danger, security, Tacitus. A vital and restless breed of men, given to tapping our toes and drumming with our fingers, infatuated with every new crazy rhythm that rears its ugly beat. We have never truly loved harmony, the graceful structure of shapes and tones. And for this blindness and deafness we pay the awful price of continuous cacophony. It gets into language as well as music. We mug melody for the sake of sound effects, and the louder and more dissonant they are, the better we seem to like them. Our national veins have taken in the singing blood of Italy, Wales, Ireland, and Germany. But the transfusion has had no beneficial effect. Great big blocky words and phrases bumble off our tongues and presses every day. In 4 weeks of purposeful listening to the radio and reading the newspapers, I have come up with a staggering list full of sound and fury, dignifying nothing. Automation, roadability, humature, motivational cognition. This baby turned up in a series of travel lectures and was never defined. Fractionalization, varietism, redesegregation, additive, concertization. This means giving a concert in a hall and is not to be confused with cinematization or televisionization. The colloquial deformity knowledgeable, which should have been clubbed to death years ago when it first began crawling about like the late Lon Chaney, has gained new life in recent months. It is a dented derby of a word, often found in the scrawny company of such battered straw hats as do-gooder, know-how, update, uptake. I recently uptook the iodine uptake test for thyroidism. And others so ugly and strange I can't decipher them in my notes. One of them looks like de-egghead, which would mean to de-intellectualize or mentally emasculate, a crippling operation approved of by an alarming number of squash heads in Washington and elsewhere. During my month of vigil and research, I heard an able physiologist who has a radio program say quite simply, "We do not use up all the food we take in." He wasn't allowed to get away with that piece of clarity, however. "Ah," cut in his announcer, for the benefit of those no longer able to understand simplicity, "the utilization factor." I turned from this station to a droning psychologist just in time to hear him say, "The female is sometimes the sexual aggressor." Here, a familiar noun of mental illness and military invasion was clumsily at work, beating in the skull of love with a verbal bung starter. The sweetheart now often wears the fustian of the sick man and the Caesar. In the evening, I tuned in one of the Space Patrol programs that gleefully exude the great big blocky-isms. "Your astrogation bank will tell you," cried the captain of a spaceship to another interplanetary pilot, meaning his navigational instruments. In a fairy tale, an astrogation bank would be a star panel, but the quality of fairy tale is nowhere to be found in these dime novels of the constellations. One Sunday morning, my head aching with kiss close and swivel chair it, meaning I guess at kissing distance and maul it over in your executive brain, respectively, I stumbled upon a small radio station that had been captured by a man of God, ominous and squealful, who was begging his listeners to live on their knees, not as slaves, but as supplicants. This particular fundamentalist, or maybe it is fundamentalitarian, had probably never heard of the great protest, "I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees." But these yammering eschatologists and many of their followers have even less respect for the glory and grace of English than the unsaved politicians. Let us cease to sugarcoat, let us cease to whitewash, let us cease to bargain counter the Bible, the speaker implored us. He finished second in vulgarity, I regret to say, to a reverend I had heard earlier in the year who shouted, "I didn't cook up this dish, God cooked it up. I'm just dishing it out to ye." The line between holiness and blasphemy becomes even thinner when some of the lay testimonialists begin ranting. "I own a shoe store in New Jersey," one of them confessed, "but Jesus Christ is my senior partner." A recent investigation of the worries and concerns of 5,000 selected Americans revealed that we are preoccupied almost wholly with the personal and private, and are troubled only mildly by political anxieties, including the danger of war, the state of civil liberties, and the internal communist threat. This does not come as a surprise to me, since the nature of our national concern about communism is proved to be personal by such expressions as anti-anti-communists and anti-anti-anti-communists. The first actually means men who are against communists, and the second, when you unravel it, means men who are against men who are against men who are against communists. In these wonderful examples of our love of formidable elaborationisms, concept and doctrine are put aside, and personalities take their place. What we have left is pure personalism, a specific reactionary who is against a specific liberal who is against Senator Malone, let us say. The multiplicity of prefixes, another sign of linguistic poverty, was touched with a fine and healthful irony in Quincy Howe's invention of the phrase ex-communist. Many will claim that for their own, but Mr. Howe got to it first. One would think that Americans would be worried, or at least concerned, by a man who may have ceased to be a man who may have ceased to be a communist, but the worry research I have mentioned showed that this isn't so. We are worried about health, family matters, and money, and we have no time for a man who may be lying about lying. Incidentally, a fairly new advertising slogan, the portable, fits neatly into modern jargon, the typewriter that you can carry, that you can carry. While I was exploring the decline of expression in America, I spent a week in a hospital. Medical science has done much for humanity, but not in the area of verbal communication. It should undergo a prefectomy and have some of its prefixes taken out. I should like to see the semi removed from semi-private, a dispiriting word that originated in hospitals. There must be a less depressing way of describing a room with 2 or more beds. I'm also for taking the sub out of subclinical and starting all over again with the idea in mind of making the word mean something. Incidentally, I discovered at the hospital the difference between to be hospitalized and to become hospitalized. The first means to be placed in a hospital, and the second has 2 meanings: to get so that you can't stand it in the hospital any longer, and to like it so much there that you don't want to leave. Lying in bed, brooding over these matters, I turned on the radio and heard an American describe another American as an old-time ADA type of anti-Jeffersonian radical, a beautiful specimen of bumblery. Sir Winston Churchill, in the exhilarating years of his public life, turned out many phrases as sharp as stilettos. For one example, squalid gammon. But you can count on your fingers the Americans, since the Thomas Paine of The Summer Soldier and The Sunshine Patriot, who have added bright, clear phrases to our language. If you can bumble an opponent to death, why stab him, seems to be the general feeling among our politicians, some of whom have got through the 12 years since the war ended with only 5 adjectives of derogation: naive, hostile, unrealistic, complacent, and irresponsible. All these slither easily, if boggily, into bumblery, and the bumbler is spared the tedious exercising of his mental faculties. The day I got dressed and was about to leave the hospital, I heard a nurse and an intern discussing a patient who had got something in his eye. "It's a bad city to get something in your eye in," the nurse said. Yes, the intern agreed, but there isn't a better place to get something in your eye out in. I rushed past them with my hair in my wild eyes and left the hospital. It was high time, too. When and if I find a reputable psychosemanticist, I want to take up with him something that happened to me one night more than 2 years ago. It may be the basis of my etymological or philological problems, if that's what they are. Words, especially big ones, are beginning to lose their meaning for me. Anyway, I woke up one summer night from a deep dream of peacelessness, only to realize that I had been startled by nothing whatever into a false sense of insecurity. I had a desperate feeling that I was being closed in on, that there was a menace in the woods behind my house or on the road in front of it, watchful, waiting, biding its time. A few weeks later, I bought a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson police revolver, which startled my wife into a genuine sense of insecurity. She hid the gun somewhere and the cartridges somewhere else, and I still don't know where they are. I have often thought of telling my psychosemanticist about it, and I sometimes have the feeling that I did call on him and that the interview went like this. "Doesn't your wife's hiding the gun worry you?" he asked. "No," I said. "It would me," he confessed. "It would what you?" I demanded. It seemed to disturb him. "What would what me?" he asked cautiously. I suddenly couldn't think of a thing. I didn't even know what was, but I had to say something, so I said something. Ill fares the land, to galloping fears a prey, where gobbledygook accumulates and words decay. About 2 years ago, a wistful attempt was made by some Washington bureau to straighten out the governmentalization of English. Directives were sent to the various departments demanding, among other things, the elimination of final I's. It was as hopeless as asking a tiny child to drop its popsicle and bathe the St. Bernard. Izationism is here to stay. It appeals to bureaucrats and congressmen because of its portentous polysyllabification. Politicians love it the way they love such expressions as legislative wise. Lord Conisford, stout defender of the Queen's English, recently paraphrased Churchill's "Give us the tools and we will finish the job" by Washingtonizing it like this: "Supply us with the implements and we will finalize the solution of the matter." Webster's Unabridged, to my sorrow, recognizes such mastodonisms as psychologize and physiologize, and a prime favorite of congressmen, analogize. It was, however, the physiologist I have already mentioned who classified those of us who are still up and about as the non-institutionalized. This is a piece of bungalorium calculated to give even the healthiest men a sense of monolithic insecurity. Non has an insidious way of creeping into izationisms. A piece of journalism was described on the air not long ago as absolutely non-fictionalized. This negationization of what once could be described as verbal communication caused a Scot of my acquaintance to ask me, "Have you nothing that is positively American? It seems to me that everything one hears about in America is un-American." This abused and imprecise arrangement of letters seems bound to lose its proud capital A before long, and to end up as un-American. President Eisenhower might well add to his imperatives the necessity to speak and write in such a way that we can be understood by the English-speaking peoples, as well as the other races of a world that stands in grave need of clarity, accuracy, and sense. The conspiracy of yammer and merchandising against literate speech reached a notorious height in 1956 with a singing commercial for a certain cigarette, which, we were told, tastes good like a cigarette should. I have 1 or 2 suggestions for the Madison Avenue illiterates in the gray flannel suits. The first is a slogan for a brewery: "We still brew good like we used to could." The second is an ad for some maker of tranquilizing drugs. "Does he seldomly praise you any more? Those kind of husbands can be cured of the grumps with hush-up. So give you and he a break. Put hush-up in his food. It don't have no taste." And now, for God's sake, let's go out and get a breath of fresh air. It's your mother. I was listening to the radio the other day, alone in a hotel room, when a young woman began singing, "Come on out, Edward, I know you're in there," which may or may not be as depressing as "Open the Door, Richard" of some years back. I don't know, because I hastily twisted the knob, hunting for normal human companionship, and found it on a 5-minute program on WOR called It's Your Baby. The narrator of the program, a man named Dan McCullough, was broadcasting helpful hints from young mothers, and I arrived just in time to learn about the Thunder Game. This ingenious diversion, invented by the mother of a little girl, is intended to allay a baby's inherent fear of the loud noises accompanying electrical storms. When there was a clap of thunder, narrated Mr. McCullough, she, the mother, imitated it with her hands, crying, "Turumba." Soon her child was doing the same, and instead of being afraid of thunder, she looked forward to the next rumble. Always wary of the tendency of our time to oversimplify problems, especially where little girls are concerned, I began to pick flaws in the Thunder Game. I have never heard anyone imitate thunder very well, and I doubt if even Paul Douglas could bring it off, because there is a lot more to it than Turumba. In a first-rate electrical storm, the lightning flash is usually followed by a tremendous splitting sound, as if the house next door were being riven in two, and there is no way to imitate this unless Mama begins smashing the furniture. Babies are born with a love of destructiveness, to be sure, but they learn early to associate it with Daddy. Mother represents, as we all know, the great security. and there is always the danger, if she lets herself go in any kind of wild abandon, that Baby will begin to identify her with the powers of darkness. I have had more experience with dogs in thunderstorms than with babies, but I have never owned one silly enough to be enticed into making sport of the growling monster of the menacing skies. My female French poodle, now going on 15, is as terrified of thunder as she was in 1941, and so, come to think of it, am I. She wedges herself under a bed when the rumbling starts, and if I went to Roomba and clapped my hands, she might never come out again. I made a couple of hasty mental notes on the thunder game and went back to Mr. McCullough. He was now describing another, much more involved pastime for mother and child. Then there was a mother whose baby would cry violently if she attempted to leave him at home while she went out, said Mr. McCullough. This is a fairly common baby fear. Baby thinks mother, his closest link to security, will never return. This mother played the game of bye-bye with her baby. She left the room, and when Baby became fearful and was about to cry, she made her reappearance with a great big smile. Doing this many times, with longer periods between leaving and coming back, made Baby realize that mother would eventually return with a happy greeting for him, and his fears disappeared. Surely even the merriest baby must tire of a whole morning or afternoon of bye-byes and greetings, and the smarter tot might conceivably gain the disturbing impression that Mama's rocker is not as sound as it should be. This game reminds me of an old Joe Cook routine, in which that famous comedian, dressed in white tie and tails, attempted to say goodnight to his butler before going out to some formal function. As I remember it, it went like this. "Good night, Harkins. Jolly times, Joe. Jolly times, Harkins. Good night, Joe. Good night, Harkins. Jolly times, Joe. Jolly times, Harkins," and on in a memorable series of frustrated exits. The bye-bye game has other faults, which might turn out to be not merely tedious, but serious. Both mother and child might learn to like the period of separation better than the period of reunion, and this could give Mama ideas about the advantages of playing the game on a more adult, if not more mature, scale. I can see Alice, let us call her, suddenly saying bye-bye to her husband George during one of his political harangues in the living room after dinner, and going upstairs to be gone 5 minutes, and then 10, and then 20. George, who loves to hear himself talk, gets more and more adjusted to these disappearances, and so when she doesn't reappear at all to listen to his analysis of the 1960 quandary of the Democratic Party, he begins to realize that he doesn't actually need her. Upstairs, meanwhile, his spouse, having made a similar discovery, is quietly packing a bag. Of course, she is going to have to take Baby with her when she slips downstairs and out the back door, and this may not be as easy as it sounds, especially if Baby gets the idea that Mama wants to play the bye-bye game again. I am not a pediatrician or a child psychologist, but I should not recommend the bye-bye game or the thunder game to every mother and child. In the case of the latter game, it has suddenly occurred to me, Baby might quite naturally begin to believe that her parent was able to cause the jolly thunder at will, and I need not diagram the tearful dilemma that would follow the infant's cruel disenchantment. Let's face it, mothers, there is no dependable method of making life with Baby a heaven on earth. 20 years ago, to change the focus but not the subject, I knew the father of a 2-year-old girl, knew him very well, and I vividly recall what happened to the poor chap when he was left alone with his daughter one evening and had to give her her supper and put her to bed. All she would eat was the ice cream he had recklessly promised her for dessert, and his efforts to sell the yum-yum game to the little girl were disastrous and pitiable. He got himself full of whatever glop it was the child was supposed to eat, and his gorge set a new high as a result. The little girl was not only willing, but delighted to let her father clean up the banana squish or corn moisties or whatever it was. A worse ordeal was still ahead of the stricken fellow who had never before tackled the formidable task of getting his small daughter into one of Dr. Radway's magical one-piece sleepy time nighties, or whatever the hell they were called. He still remembers unfastening something and beholding the garment fall to the carpet where it lay like a great, complicated, dead butterfly. "Lie down on that," he said to his daughter desperately. He had once tried to put the tire chains on his car by spreading them out on the roadway and trying to back into them, and the little girl may have remembered the consequences. "You don't do it that way," she said scornfully. He broke down completely at this. "Come on, for God's sake," he wailed. "Be a sport. Lie down on that thing." She just stood there. Her father finally got her into one of his own clean shirts. It came down around her ankles and proved to be a great success and a wonderful solution of a knotty problem, although it must be admitted that the child's mother didn't think very highly of it. It also had what could be called a disturbing after effect, for when the little girl got into her teens, she was more interested in wearing her father's shirts than any garments of her own. He sometimes accuses himself of having started this fad, for fad it has become on a national scale. All teenage girls, I understand, would rather wear their father's shirts than the ones actually created for them by manufacturers. Why they insist on wearing them outside their blue jeans, nobody seems to know, but the fashion has the nation in its grip, and nothing can be done about it now. It's Your Baby, so far as I know, gets no helpful hints from fathers, but I shall pass one on to Mr. McCullough for what it may be worth. I learned about it from a young mother who lives in Bermuda. In order to keep her little girl occupied for an hour or so around dawn, so that she could get a little more sleep herself, this parent hit on the idea of spreading 20 graham crackers in 5 rows of 4 crackers each in front of the child in its crib. In this way, the baby can have its game and eat it, too. A diet consisting in part of some 7,000 graham crackers a year does not seem to have had a bad effect on this baby, and the National Biscuit Company will probably love the idea of the cracker game. Mr. McCullough, to get back to our narrator, ended the program I was listening to as follows. "And this is Dan McCullough advising mothers never to lose their sense of humor, like the mother who was trying to make her stubborn child eat. She ran out of patience finally and said, 'Look, honey baby, eat. Make believe it's sand.' If your own baby prefers caterpillars to sand or some other tidbits, such as buttons or small pieces of coal, these can, of course, be substituted. As simple as that, Mother."